Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us. Another session of Why Marx. Tonight, we're actually starting a little mini series on the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution. Why? I hear you ask. It's been 35 years, and I've been told that, yeah, 35 years since it's collapsed. Why do we have to look back at these things, talk about dead Russians, etc., etc.? Well, I'd argue it remains a huge question for the left, and I'm sure lots of other people see it that way. For communists and socialists today, it's not an immediate tactical question anymore. You know, do we defend this or that about the particular action of the Soviet Union, or this or that question? But it remains a huge question in terms of answering what people want to know about communism. Do we want that? You know, do we think that was communism, socialism, a worker state? Do we want to emulate the Russian Revolution? Did everything go well? Is that how it would happen today? I think these remain really, really important questions. And so we divided up into a few chunks, a few sessions to discuss various issues around it. So we're pleased to have with us for the first session tonight, Jack Conrad. He will look at the Russian Revolution and the nature of the Soviet Union. And after he's spoken for about 45 minutes, we'll open up for questions and comments from the floor. Thanks for joining us, Jack.
My pleasure. Well, I'm not really going to talk about the Russian Revolution. More going to talk about the nature of the Soviet Union. Okay. The Russian Revolution. The most important thing, I think, to understand is really what was the plan. And the plan was sketched out by Lenin. Obviously, there were Marxists in Russia before him, but the plan that he mapped out, two tactics of social democracy, really worth while reading. Basically what he says is the bourgeoisie won't lead the Russian Revolution. Everyone knew a revolution was coming. It will be the proletariat, but given their small numbers, it will have to be an alliance with the peasantry. But the crucial thing is that this revolution will trigger the European Revolution. And if it does that, then Russia can go uninterruptedly to the tasks of socialism. So it would go from being the vanguard in Europe to really, its proper place. And that is a country that's reliant on following the lead of Western Europe, Germany, Britain, France, and all the rest of it. Of course, we know what happened. The Russian Revolution succeeded. The Tsar was overthrown. Provisional government was overthrown, but the revolution was isolated. To use a phrase from Winston Churchill, well, the revolution wasn't quite strangled in its crib, but nonetheless, it was disfigured. It was starved of oxygen. It suffered all sorts of defects. Either way, if we look at Bolshevik leaders, just after the revolution in the early 20s, what they didn't expect was that counter-revolution would come from within. They expected counter-revolution without. Lenin famously in 1919 urged successfully the Bolsheviks to keep their minimum program. We might have to retreat. But the fact of the matter is, having fought the Civil War, having isolated themselves not only from the peasantry, but having seen the working class itself to a very large measure declassed, what you had is a regime that had no, how should I put it, civilized route to retreat. Anyway, what I'm going to do is not so much to examine the politics of the 1920s or the 1930s. What I'm going to do is really introduce you to what I think, how should I put it, is a more useful approach when we're talking about what the Soviet Union was, what's the nature of the Soviet Union. There've been plenty of narrative histories, some of them very good, a lot of them awful, half lies, half truth, a lot of them even more full of lies than truth. Either way, what I want to do is just really take you back to when I was writing about the Soviet Union. This would be, in the first time, this would be in a worthwhile way, in the late 1980s into the early 1990s. I predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse. I didn't think it would be a good thing. I thought it would trigger a period of reaction. I think we're still in it. It didn't trigger the red 1990s, to use Peter Taft's words. It didn't, mean a period of reaction where we all, had to operate underground. But really, the bourgeoisie succeeded in marginalizing us, pushing us out on the intellectual fringe. That socialism had definitively failed. The only system that was conceivable was capitalism. And in many ways, we still live in that period. Now, as I said, I was writing in this period as a journalist, but given the collapse of the Soviet Union, although we put my writings together in a book, what was it called? From October to August, and some of the stuff in it is, I think, with all modesty, pretty good. Nonetheless, I was acutely aware that a great deal more had to be done. And, I'd read Hillel Tichtin's, writings, in critique. I'd read, I think, the best Marxist writers available on the Soviet Union question. But what I decided to do, just as an experiment, is really take Lenin as my cue, where in his philosophical notebooks, he made, the remark that while Marx didn't leave behind a logic, and he's of course talking in reference to Hegel, he did leave behind capital, and capital can be treated not only as a critique of capitalist political economy, but it also can be used as a logic by Marxists. And if you look at Hegel's logic, I would recommend it, but especially the opening section. What Hegel described there, he said, look, what does science begin with? That was the question he asked. And basically what he put forward, the argument that he put forward, is it begins, and I'm paraphrasing, it begins with the atomic particle of that society. And indeed, we've got correspondence between Marx and Engels and Marx and other comrades, of where he talks before he goes back to, producing his volume 1 of Capital. He remarks, I've just been rereading Hegel's logic, and you can see Hegel's logic in Capital, and you can see it especially in the opening sections of Capital. It's of course not that Capital is an objective idealist approach. No, it's a thoroughly materialist approach. Nonetheless, what does Marx begin with in Capital? He doesn't describe, capitalism as he does in the Communist Manifesto, all its huge achievements and, the wonders of steam power and these huge factories and, telegraphs that capitalism had presided over. No, he begins with the commodity. And he said, well, this is how capitalist wealth presents itself. And then he proceeds step by step to look at this commodity, break it apart and say, well, what is the commodity? It's something useful, but there's something more to it. It also is something that has exchange value. And if we look at capital, we take this basic contradiction, and this contradiction is developed in all its richness, in all its complexity. Now, of course, we know that Marx's project was vast to begin with. I think it was something like 6 books, of which Capital, and we're talking about Capital 1, 2, 3, plus theories of surplus value, were a part of. And Marx had a project to write about the state, wage labor, foreign trade, and a whole host of other subjects. So we need to understand that Capital is a radically incomplete project. Nonetheless, what I did is say, well, okay, we can't copy Capital. That's just a waste of time. But what if we use Capital as a logic? What if we use this logic of Hegel as a way of approaching the Soviet Union? You know, what sort of results will we get? And so, just as a sort of thought experiment to begin with, I asked myself, well, what did the Soviet Union produce? Did it produce a commodity? And once you ask that question, I think the only honest answer, whatever Soviet textbooks tell you, is that no, it didn't produce a commodity. It didn't produce something with exchange value. It produced something, and again, we can go into this, it produced something which had use value, but there was something more to this, what I would call a product, than mere use value. It produced these use values that the Soviet Union used to boast about, every 5-year plan, every year plan, every month, you know, targets fulfilled, new records broken. It produced these commodities on the basis of control figures, I think more accurately rendered as a system of targets. Why? Because when we look at the Soviet Union, when we go in and examine actually what's going on under the bonnet, so to speak, what we discover is far from this society being, I think the term was developed, in the 1930s, but it came into vogue in the 50s. Far from it being a totalitarian society, you know, where those at the top were in total control of everything that was going on in the society and had total control over every individual in society. Quite the opposite was the case. There was political repression. There's no doubt about that. There was censorship of a surreal sort. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that those at the pinnacle of society actually had only the vaguest idea of what was actually going on in society. Because what we had is a situation of where, yeah, products were produced, but what we find very quickly is that you had a permanent problem from the very beginning with the first 5-year plan. And that's really my starting point, not new economic policy or war communism. It's the 5-year plan that I think I take as my starting point in terms of trying to critique the Soviet Union, is that what it experienced was a brilliant ability to produce quantities, but a woeful inability to produce qualities. Now, that is something you can find in the commentary, the commentaries of Leon Trotsky in the 30s, but you can also find it. In every report to congresses and conferences by Soviet general secretaries, prime ministers, and ministers, and at every congress, at every plenum of the Central Committee, the same problems are located, resolutions are passed, and lo and behold, once we go further down the line, the same problems reoccur. And indeed, a piece of reading which I would recommend, which I haven't mentioned so far, is the publications of Novosti and Progress, the official publishing houses in the Soviet Union that produced, the works of Brezhnev, Stalin, Khrushchev, Gorbachev, you name it. And they actually are worth studying. It's not because everything they say is truthful. As I said, actually, we know that many of the things that they said that weren't truthful isn't because of a want of trying. But the point I'm making is that the same problems keep reoccurring, and the fundamental problem that we have is this inability to produce qualities. So, for example, if you produce 100 tons of steel, that's great. That can be boasted about. We're catching up with Germany. We've overtaken Germany. We're catching up with the United States. But how much of that steel was usable? How much of that steel had to be actually re-smelted before it could go towards tanks or car frames or ship hulls or bridges or railway track? Anyway, if we take the product as our starting point, and then we look at how this product was produced, and I've argued already that it was produced not for exchange value, it was produced for target of value. What we also discover very quickly is that the use, for example, of rubles, which you can read in these reports, you can read it in the textbooks of the Soviet Union. What you discover very quickly is, of course, that rubles weren't real money. If we look at capital, Marx defines money as the universal equivalent. What we find in the Soviet Union is it was a partial equivalent, and even then a really crippled equivalent. So the classic phrase amongst ordinary people in the Soviet Union was, don't bother with 100 rubles in your pocket or purse. No, cultivate 100 friends. They are a lot more useful when it comes to obtaining use values than rubles are. And certainly when it comes to enterprises, although you have rubles exchanging on the books of Gosbank, the fact of the matter is that companies, or enterprises, I should say, that made massive and consistent losses were never put out of business. Indeed, the state came along and took away off the books these rubles. And the fact of the matter is that there was no attempt to shift consistently loss-making enterprises into a more profitable line of business. Why? Because the state and other enterprises weren't interested in who made a profit and who made a loss. What primarily concerned them, of course, was the use values that they could obtain through this system. The idea of introducing rubles into it was meant to introduce rationality. It 100% failed to achieve that. So although you had rubles and consistent losses, or some enterprises making consistent profits, The fact of the matter is that this low quality of the product continued. And what we had in the Soviet Union, unlike capitalism, which has a problem of realization, what we had in the Soviet Union from the very start is a system of shortages. Products were in short supply. Targets were always above the capability, the real capability of the vast majority of enterprises. And crucially, it wasn't just products that were in chronic short supply, so was labor. So unemployment, effective unemployment, was abolished very early on in the 5-year plan. And what you can read from managers, what you can read from general secretaries, prime ministers, ministers throughout society is the shortage of labor. Okay, so we now come to labor. And my argument would be that if rubles weren't real money, it follows logically, and we can discuss it, we can illustrate it, that wages couldn't have been real wages either. What we had in the Soviet Union wasn't therefore wage labor. We didn't have slave labor except at the margins. What we had was semi-free labor. And of course, when I'm talking about free labor, I mean it in the capitalist sense, that the worker has been freed from any direct relationship to the means of production, but has the ability to move from one enterprise to another and sell their ability to labor, not themselves, but their ability to labor. In the Soviet Union, what you had is an obligation enforced by law, anti-parasite laws, for the worker to deliver their ability to labor. But what you saw, having delivered that labor, wasn't payment by result. You didn't have the payment of wages. You had all sorts of attempts to impose, piecework and payment by result in terms of quantities as opposed to qualities. Either way, what we saw in the history of the Soviet Union is something very peculiar, and that is the falling behind of highly skilled workers like doctors, teachers, university professors, compared with average workers. And so what you saw is a rapid closing of, I'll call it the ruble gap. It didn't really signify particularly much, to the point where, your average worker was earning more than an engineer. And you can read all about that, in, as I said, Stalin, Brezhnev. And they had this campaign that went on from the beginning, first 5-year plan, to the very end with Gorbachev against equalization. Far from them championing equality, as was the original aim of the Russian Revolution, as was the aim of Marxism. So equal work, for equal returns under the first stage of communism. No, what you saw is a situation of where skill, education didn't get rewarded, quite the contrary. And that was against the wishes, and this is the important point, that was against the wishes of those at the top. Now, okay, I want to move on now just to discuss workers. It needs to be emphasized, I've already said it, that workers, were politically expropriated. We can talk about exactly when, but I'm just going to take that, by the time we get to 29, 30, 31, I'm just going to take that for granted. They couldn't organize their own trade unions. The official trade unions were taken over by the political elite. Workers couldn't freely express themselves. They couldn't publish themselves. They couldn't organize themselves, in other words, as a class. So the class that made the October Revolution was declassed, not just because of the Civil War. It was permanently declassed. It was atomized, indeed. And therefore, it's at least worthwhile putting forward the idea that the Soviet working class wasn't a class. And what I mean by that is it was a class of, it was a formless mass of exploited human beings, yes, but it couldn't act as an alternative. Nonetheless, what we find inside Soviet factories, what we find in terms of the complaints of general secretaries, ministers, managers, enterprise managers, is that the workers exercised what you can call negative control. So they didn't have positive control over their product. They couldn't direct the product according to their interests or their collective will, but they did exercise negative control. In other words, what we saw inside the Soviet enterprise, as opposed to the capitalist company, is a situation of where the managers did their utmost, not only to get hold of more and more material things. So if you're a steelwork, more and more coal, more and more iron, in order to smelt it and produce your steel, but also there was a constant striving to take on more and more workers in order to meet what were impossible in reality targets that had been set from the center, upon which, in terms of at least fulfilling them on paper, not only did your career depend, but in the 1930s, perhaps your life depended on it. So you can read accounts, for example, of American and German workers who went to work in the Soviet Union in this period. Stephen Kotkin had also produced a useful book, an American academic, on Magnitogorsk. The point is, though, that under those circumstances, workers had to be won to cooperate with the managers. And what you saw is a situation, instead of threatening workers with the sack, the managers would do their best to conciliate with the workers. And quite frankly, if a manager did sack a worker, it was a matter of basically supreme indifference. And indeed, in spite of laws being passed, and that is really also worthwhile studying, the stream of draconian laws that the center was passing that were absolutely ignored, outside congresses, by ordinary people, by managers. Managers could sack workers. Of course they could. They were very reluctant to sack them. There were instances of it, but in 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, it was actually workers who, in spite of the law, just walked out, and they could walk down the road to another enterprise, get employment, because the manager there was desperate for workers. They would offer them incentives, not only higher rubles, which weren't really such a draw, but also rations, also accommodation, also holidays, also schools, all sorts of different perks. Managers, sports clubs, theater tickets, you name it. This is what managers attempted to supply workers with. Now, we don't want to get carried away and imagine that workers in the 1930s or the 1940s had the life of Raleigh. The situation was desperate. We all know about starvation in the countryside. I'm not going to deal with collectivization. I'm not going to deal with collective farmers. But while you had starvation in the countryside, you had hunger in the cities. It was a desperate situation. Housing was appalling. Soviet workers were notoriously badly dressed. But it's interesting, in spite of falling real wages, and that's what, you get various Western experts talking about, perhaps the biggest drop in living standards ever recorded in history. The fact of the matter is, if you look at studies of the human body, if you look at the stature of children, what you find in the early 30s is that actually there wasn't a deterioration. In spite of this massive, seemingly drop in living standards, Soviet kids basically kept the same level of health that they had in the 1920s. And indeed, if we look later on, what we see in the Soviet Union, and I'm simply observing it and saying we need an explanation here, is that in terms of height, in terms of general fitness, and indeed in terms of longevity, what we saw in the Soviet Union was a catching up with the United States. Now, we can go on about how bad things are now in the United States, but nonetheless, that point remains. And therefore, what we need, I believe, is something more than merely looking at rubles and what rubles could buy in state shops or in private markets in the cities. The fact of the matter is that while you had this sort of, proletariat that was also a semi-peasantry because of garden plots and dachas, you also had a situation where the government introduced rationing, and that was something that enterprises were able to supply to their workers, one, to stop them going hungry, but actually what you saw is an improvement in their overall life expectancy and real living standards. Now, as I said, that clearly wasn't in accordance with the wishes of those above. We can go into what was expected in the first 5-year plan, and I suppose that is worthwhile mentioning. My own take on it is, looking at the figures, looking at the various accounts, this was a sort of Stalin's version of primitive accumulation, a phrase, of course, that I presume he stole from Przewozhensky, who again adopted it from contemporaries in the early 20s in the Soviet Union, of course, took it from Capital, the last section of Capital, the primitive accumulation of capital. But the point would be that while the intention might have been to exploit the peasantry, to take surplus from the countryside, everything that I've read, everything that I can come up with shows me that failed, that what you had is a situation where the peasantry were collectivized. They could no longer hold the cities to ransom. Their product was controlled by the state, whether it was in collective farms or state farms. But the fact of the matter is the surplus actually was generated by the urban working class. Either way, what you had is a situation which I would argue that you didn't have under capitalism, and that is an ability of the system to fall back on and to become successful by going beyond absolute exploitation. If you recall your Capital, absolute exploitation is characteristic of the early phases of capitalism. We all know the statistics of life expectancy in Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, London, 15, 20, the average life expectancy for a worker. But how capitalism, when it had to concede to the organized working class, developed and became reliant not on absolute exploitation, and that is the extension of hours and the effort, the physical effort that goes in to work. No, it became reliant on relative exploitation, the introduction of machinery, the development of new technique. That is something, of course, you saw in the Soviet Union. There can be no doubt about it. We've got all manner of accounts, about them buying on a huge scale American technology, German technology. Indeed, American technique was a sort of magic word, in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. But what you saw was the inability, fatal inability, to make that a continuous process. So the Soviet Union showed a great facility in opening new enterprises and equipping them either with pirated versions of Western technology, or Western technology purchased off the peg, so to speak. But what you had inside existing enterprises, for all sorts of reasons, is a reluctance, a refusal to actually continually revolutionize the tools of production. That was partially because of managerial conservatism, not some individual quirk, a social conservatism that was, how should I put it, there, given the nature of the system, and also no enthusiasm by workers for the introduction of new technology, plenty of complaints from above, plenty of explanations that managers were just crazy or something along those lines. But again, the reoccurrence of these problems throughout the history of the Soviet Union. So I can remember, when I started coming into politics, reading, what was it called? Soviet Weekly. I don't know if anyone else remembers it, but just reading an account in it of Soviet managers when they started to introduce Western supplies of computers, managers who left these computers outside the enterprise in the rain and the snow. They had no interest, no wish to introduce computer technology in their enterprise. It was be too disruptive, and that put them in danger. It put workers in danger of not meeting their targets, and it also put managers in danger of not meeting their targets. And therefore, what they decided to do, because you had existing supply routes, is to stick with what they knew. And under those circumstances, it's still true that while in the 1930s, a manager who was purportedly failing could often face a sentence in the gulag or a bullet in the back of the head. Even when we take the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, Soviet managers on average only stayed in post for 3 years. And that wasn't simply because of the career ladder took them ever higher. No, you had a situation of where they were being dispensed with for failure by those that occupied higher posts. And therefore, you had this, as I said, this conservative behavior. Okay, 9 minutes past, so just a little bit longer. Okay. Let's finish by just looking at other approaches, traditional approaches to the Soviet Union. My own study, which I suppose is, as I said, to begin with, is based on Capital, was going to include, and I still intend it to include, a whole number of other volumes to the one that I've already completed. We're editing it at the present time. But also what I've aimed to do is to produce something the equivalent of theories of surplus value, which means looking at the other theories that are current about the Soviet Union. Well, here I'm not going to deal with, I've already mentioned totalitarian theory. You could talk about interest theory. You can talk about convergence theory. You name it. There are, dozens upon dozens of different theories developed, about the Soviet Union by the paid persuaders of the bourgeoisie. I just wanted really to look at the dominant theories on the left. And quite frankly, while I sort of understand, directly after the Russian Revolution, maybe in the 1920s, maybe in the 1930s, while these labels were developed or coined, the fact of the matter is, if we want to talk about Marxism, none of them add up to Marxism. Marxism isn't about, going around the world and just labeling things, let alone when it comes to society. If you imagine that you've solved something by looking at China, reading a newspaper article by China, if you imagine you've solved something by calling it state capitalism, just think again. I mean, you've given it a label. What a contribution to human knowledge. You could call it bureaucratic collectivism if you want, because, hey, state capitalism doesn't fit. And certainly when it comes to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, if you don't have wage labor, if you don't have money, if you don't have wages, if you don't have the accumulation of capital, calling it state capitalism, I just think is, well, let's be generous. No, let's not be generous. It's nonsense. Tony Cliff, for example, made the point, and I think it's a valid point. He called it state capitalism, but of course he was right when he said the law of value, of course, doesn't operate in the Soviet Union. The law of value, he argued in his book, State Capitalism in Russia, was imposed on Russia from the outside. In other words, the Soviet Union competed with the West. Okay, there's a truth there, but okay, having said that, well, what were the laws that worked inside the Soviet Union? He said, for example, that the Soviet Union was just like one big enterprise, that workers, when they went to an enterprise, it made no difference. It made every difference. Only someone who actually didn't want to look inside the Soviet Union and get to grips with what was really driving the Soviet Union forward, but also then ultimately leads to what was, I think, an inevitable downfall, isn't doing justice to the Marxist method. The same applies in my view. I've got sympathy with him, with Trotsky. It's a degenerate workers' state. He argued this in the 30s. He says it's a provisional, characterization. He didn't want to push his luck and come to anything hard and fast. And of course, Stalin, through his agents, ensured that he didn't go any further by killing him. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think it does. Trotsky. I don't think it honors Trotsky to simply repeat what was a mistaken view in the 1930s. The idea that you could seriously characterize Soviet workers who were atomized. Okay, they exercised negative control, but the idea that this non-class was the ruling class in any way is clearly not a Marxist view. And Trotsky, of course, fell back not on relations of production, is what Marx seeks to lay bare and get a grip on. He fell back on property forms. What a load of nonsense. So things were nationalized. Well, yeah, So they were in many societies. If we look at, Bronze Age civilizations, if you look at pharaonic Egypt, there are plenty of examples of widespread nationalization. But okay, so Soviet workers seized factories in the immediate aftermath of the October Revolution. But the fact of the matter is, definitively, as I said, we can deal with the 20s separately if someone wants to bring it up, but definitively, in the 1930s, here was an exploited class, an exploited mass. And that is what we need to be looking at. The extraction of surplus, not surplus value, no, of course not, but surplus product from that class, a product which they had no control of once it had left the enterprise. This wasn't something they owned, it wasn't something they controlled. So describing the Soviet Union as a degenerate worker state, I just don't think works, let alone when it comes to imitator states, not of October 1917, the imitator states of the 5-year plan, i.e. China, Eastern Europe, Vietnam, Cuba, Korea, and if you want to talk about African countries, fair enough. No, they weren't deformed worker state. Now, I wouldn't argue, as I've already indicated, they were capitalism. But in my view, call it whatever you want. I'm not fixated on the label. We all need labels, of course we do. Nonetheless, the important thing isn't labeling of this society. It's actually getting to grips with its laws, its contradictions, which show that this actually wasn't a mode of production. In other words, what we had born in the 1930s wasn't something that was a mode of reproduction. And therefore, while you couldn't have predicted the exact date that the Soviet Union collapsed, you could predict that it was running out of steam. You can look back at Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR, 1952. You can look at the capitalist temptation, with Bukharin and Stalin, let alone Gorbachev and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is that what the Soviet Union crucially was running out of is people, is workers. They couldn't revolutionize, the mode of production. They relied on new workers going into new factories. Once they'd run out of workers from the countryside, workers from the household, workers from school, the end of the system was only a matter of time. And the fact of the matter is that if the leadership hadn't collapsed it themselves, it would have stagnated. It would have gone into absolute decline. Instead, they go for the capitalist option. It was chaotic. I'm not going to go there. I will finish there instead. So thank you, Tina.
Thanks very much, Comrade. Comrades, if you have questions, contributions, please click raise hand and we can make you into a panelist, so you can come in and ask questions. Just one quick question from me. I can see people have their hands up already. You did touch on it, the beginning, and I think that's a really important part. I mean, you looked at, I quite agree that's in a non-automotive production, no working class control, etc. You've got, it's not socialist, it's not capitalist, it's something else. Some people want to put a label on it, but how it happened, I think is important. And was there ever an alternative? Sort of in 1990-20, when it was clear that the Germans weren't going to make revolution, and the poor Russians there, having made their revolution, insisting, waiting for the Germans to spark revolution to come to their aid, really, when they knew they couldn't hang on by themselves. And then they had to, and then they did. And we can criticize, and we do criticize what happened in the Soviet Union, obviously. But, was there ever a particular moment where you think things couldn't have gone back anymore? I mean, Mike McNair in his book Revolutionary Strategy puts the date, I think, at 1921 and the ban of factions, and says, there was no legal way for the working class to reclaim power after that banning of factions and militarization of the party, which in effect, was the representation of the working class. You mentioned 1929, bit later. I suspect you're also not a fan of the ban on factions. But was there a possibility of it going another way if they hadn't done that? The banning of the faction, the total control of the workers, absolute lack of democracy. Was there ever a possibility of not full communism, obviously, but doing something else in your view?
Okay, interesting question. I don't think, I mean, other than proletarian revolution in Germany, blah, 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 I don't think that there was a positive road. My guess, for what it's worth, is that if they'd continued to make further concessions to capitalism, there would have been a counter-revolution. But the chances are that this would have been a counter-revolution from the outside and would have ended with massive bloodshed. We saw that in the Finnish Revolution, Petrograd, Moscow, there would have been whole-scale massacring. If Trotsky had been in charge, I mean, I've got a little bit in my book, what if? They're worthwhile experiments. What if Trotsky had carried out a military coup in the early 20s? Well, one, I don't think then he's the heroic Trotsky of the 1930s, the critic. I think he then becomes a Bonapartist figure. Could he have put forward, a road that didn't lead to disaster? I don't think so. I just can't see it. You could argue, again, counterfactual history, great, that he would have been less barbaric than Stalin, and perhaps it's hard to imagine anything more barbaric than the first 5-year plan and the Great Purges. That's true. Nonetheless, you would have still had a situation where the working class wasn't the ruling class. You would have had the consolidation in some sense of the bureaucracy. Call it whatever you will, a caste. I don't call it a class. Call it whatever you will. No, I don't think there was a way out, long and the short. Yes, of course, the ban on factions was a crucial turning point. But what I'm trying to describe here with 29 is the birth of a new system, not the degeneration of the October Revolution, but the birth of something new, something that was an exploitative system resting on the exploitation of the working class and the peasantry. So no, worthwhile just finishing, I suppose. What happens if Bukharin and his faction had triumphed? Would a Chinese road be possible? No. Why? Because we need to understand China not as the brilliance of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, but a deal done with a global hegemon. And capitalism wasn't going to do a deal with the Soviet Union in the 1920s or the 1930s. My own reading is we're dealing with one of the tragedies of history, the inability of the working class on a global scale not to make the breakthrough. And I would argue, and I have argued, that if we look at other such transitions, from feudalism to capitalism, from slavery to feudalism, you also see this huge variety of what I would call freak societies that showed some elements of the future, but really couldn't make that transition. So the sort of label, for want of anything better, that I've given the Soviet Union, those that know their gynecology know what I'm talking about. an ectopic social formation, something that isn't able to go full stage into a baby, into a new society, something that is trapped, and that's a tragedy. And I think that's what we saw in the Soviet Union.
Thank you. Paul, please.
Yeah, I'll bring my picture up and all.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, no, Paul Smith first. Sorry.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
Paul.
Right.
Hi.
There you
Hi. Yeah, Jack, thanks very much for a really interesting and informative talk. I really liked your approach from the contradiction within the commodity, and that leads on to the questions you were talking about in terms of the usefulness or non-usefulness of the Soviet product, and the contradiction within use value, which kind of determines the nature of that regime. I also like the way that you put together just the part of Soviet history that is post-purges, and saw that as being a separate kind of regime, which could be analyzed as you were trying to do. So my question is not really a critical one on the front of anything you've said tonight. It's more to do with what I've read in the pages of Weekly Worker, and it's to do with the labels, which you were quite rightly criticizing with, and in particular the label bureaucratic socialism. So I've got a question about that characterization, and it's in 4 parts. And the first part is, as you mentioned, nationalized property relations are compatible with class society, and in this case, the continued accumulation of capital worldwide. And secondly, if workers had no democratic control of the productive process, which again you highlighted very clearly, it makes planning impossible. And thirdly, if the bureaucratic elite extracted a surplus from workers through coercive means, including slave labor, and finally, if a socialist society presupposes abundance, and the former Soviet Union was a society of scarcity, how can the label of bureaucratic socialism be in any way meaningful? Thank you.
Thanks, comrade. Jack, take 2 or 3, I suggest. Yeah. Okay. Agnes, please, if you could switch on your camera. Hello, comrade.
Am I on?
Yes, you are. Hi.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Yeah, a fascinating lecture or presentation. But I'd just like to make a couple of comments, if I may, more comments than questions. You mentioned, Jack, that the Soviet Union collapsed because of it had to collapse. It came to an end and the leaders collapsed it. Well, I think there was an awful lot of help from the United States and Great Britain, and an awful lot of people worked very hard. They were dedicated to make sure that the Soviet Union collapses. And I actually knew some people who did just that. That was their job. They were employed by this and that and so on. So that's one comment. The other comment is that I know that money makes the world go round, and you're talking about value. But I would like to mention that I spent the first 20 years of my life in communist Hungary, which was pretty similar to what was going on in Soviet Union at the same time. And I like to mention that culture was cultivated enormously. And I personally think that that is a very, very, very important part of our lives. So music, and not only culture, sport as well. Now, when it came to competitions, it was always the Soviet participants who won in all music competitions and sport competitions and so on. And in Hungary, there was no such thing as private schools and state schools. They were all state schools, and we did have equal opportunities. You could argue that they were not very great opportunities, but they were equal opportunities. So this is what I'm trying to say, that education and culture was amazing in the communist Hungary where I was brought up. And thank you for giving me the time to mention this. So that's it.
Thanks, Agnes. The next, Rafal and Andy G. If you want to speak, you have to accept being made a panelist. So Rafal, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, Jack, for the talk. Very interesting. I suppose what I'd like to do is defend the premise of the Soviet Union as being fundamentally capitalist and defend. I think that the labels are important. I think conceptualizing and maintaining a conception of the Soviet Union as capitalist has important consequences for our thinking. I think that this notion of either bureaucratic socialism or the Soviet Union having a non-mode of production, I don't think it is consistent with Marxism, ultimately. I think that in the Soviet Union, we ultimately see, a mode of production is not some sort of ideal type that is imposed on a given society. It's a generalized frame description of the relations of production that predominate in a given society. And I think that you can't look at the Soviet Union and not see that it's wage labor relations that predominate in the society. Now, you can argue that, well, the ruble was not real money. It wasn't real currency. It was really just state accounting tokens. And therefore, the wages were not paid out. But I think when you look at, especially in industrial production, when the Soviet Union piece rate wages predominated pretty much for the entire history, even though they tried to phase them out, they still made up the majority, And, I'd point out that Marx identifies piece rate wages as the form of wage labor that is most in harmony with the capitalist mode of production. Furthermore, you claim that the Soviet Union exclusively produced use values. It did not produce commodities, it did not produce exchange values, but I think it did because it engaged in foreign trade. And in international competition. It existed in an environment of interstate competition. It had to compete in the global state hierarchy, which necessitated capital accumulation. It necessitated, the appropriation of vast amounts of surplus product, far greater in proportion than many Western capitalist states, whether this was in the form of slave labor in the gulags, whether it was in the form of the piece rate system, which is designed to maximize production. And excuse me. I think that in describing the Soviet Union as capitalist, that's not a negative judgment intrinsically, because at least it's I believe that this is an inextricable element of it being a proletarian dictatorship. I think a worker state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, is intrinsically operating under the capitalist mode of production, because you can't have, first of all, under socialism there is no state, so how can you have a worker state? And under socialism there is no proletariat, so how can you have a proletariat dictatorship? The dictatorship of the proletariat describes precisely the transitional moment of history where the proletariat seizes control of the capitalist mode of production, seizes control of the capitalist state in order to liquidate the bourgeois class and change the mode of production to a socialist one. In the Soviet Union, of course, this was impossible based on the backwards nature of the economy, and due to the conditions of siege and the defeat of revolution in the West, which forced them to remain on the capitalist track. I think that the socialization of the economy in the territory of the USSR would have led to disaster in the conditions they existed in. They had to maintain a capitalist mode of production. And I think, when we speak about a degenerated worker state, Trotsky's theory, I think it applies perfectly, because I've seen arguments to the effect that a degenerated worker state, well, this wasn't a worker state at all. How can it be degenerated? It ceased to be a worker state at some given point, the 5-year plan, the Great Purge, Khrushchev, the revisionist, the anti-revisionist theory, rather. But I think that degeneration is clearly a process where the society has attempted to, with revolutionary momentum, transcend from capitalism to socialism. It's been stopped in its tracks and began a slow, very painful process of degeneration, sliding back down the hill towards ultimately counter-revolution. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I think that's actually enough. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Raphael. Jack, do you want to come back to a few things now?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Otherwise, I'll lose track. Yeah, Paul really asked me about labels. Well, Paul, you've read your Communist Manifesto, and from my memory, what you've got in there is bourgeois socialism, reactionary socialism, feudal socialism, and you're going to tell me you can't have that. Well, you can. Depends what you mean by it. So again, if you don't like the word socialism, fair enough being used other than positive. But the fact of the matter is, this is what the Soviet Union, the Union of Socialist, etc., called itself, and these countries in Eastern Europe, China. Okay, if you don't want to use that word, you're perfectly free to do so. I don't think it really takes us I don't think it takes us forward anywhere. So I have made the point that whatever label one wants to give it, fair enough. The real question is what's going on under the bonnet. And so therefore, for example, I've coined an ectopic social formation. Well, that will make you happy because that hasn't got the word socialism in it. But it's not the point. It's not, the label doesn't give you the analysis. The analysis comes first. And quite frankly, from my point of view, you can call it what you want. And if it makes you happy not to call it socialist, you can call it Stalinist if you want. Stalin was denounced in 1956. Fair enough. Okay, great. But I don't think that takes us forward. I mean, Marx talked about Spartan socialism, Inca socialism. Marx actually didn't like the word socialism. That's the long and the short of it. So, okay, all I'm doing is saying, here's a label, but that's not the point. The precise point is, as you were saying, Paul, what matters is this contradiction in the product, the fact that you didn't have commodity production, and what laws did you have operating in the Soviet Union? We're not talking about legal forms, we're talking about social forms. To me, that's the important question. Agnes, you're absolutely right. Of course, what we had, in the United States, the global hegemon, 43, 45, whatever date one wants to choose, is a situation of containment. And then with Carter, then with Ronald Reagan, rollback. And so, of course, they were active. The old Pope, John Paul II, 50 million quid's worth of CIA money channeled into Solidarnosc. So I'm aware of that. But really what I'm trying to point out is if you take Yeltsin, if you take Gorbachev, they might not have known exactly what they were doing, but they wanted to transition the system. And what you had is loads of people at the top. They tended to be the younger sort. So as well as your mafia lot, you had, people in the Young Communist League, junior ministers. I mean, I've looked at billionaires in present day Russia, and loads of them, were go-get young technocrats under Gorbachev. They wanted to get their money, their hands on money. They wanted to enjoy shopping in Harrods. They wanted their, Highgate house, their flat in New York, their kids into high class, English schools. They wanted, paintings. We want to enjoy what the ruling class in the West has got, instead of this situation of where, if my career goes wrong, I end up as a manager, I don't know, of a power plant or a meat processing factory. So these people wanted to become capitalists. So what I'm describing, of course, is, one-sided. I readily admit that. But we need to understand why those at the top of the bureaucracy did want to take, that course. They saw that their system wasn't working, and they wanted to set themselves up with inheritable wealth, with capitalist wealth. That's my reading of it. As to the achievements, yes, you're absolutely right. Anyone who knows anything about culture, can only but admire aspects of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I mean, I know, when it comes to plays, a Shakespeare play produced in Georgia is a masterwork, because they spent so long perfecting it. Soviet orchestras, the Berlin Ensemble, you name it, huge cultural achievements. But on the other hand, there was that situation where artists were straitjacketed. And in that sense, I'm reminded again, I'm an admirer of church music for my sins. I'm an atheist who loves church music. But I mean, look at the marvels of church music in the medieval times. But if you were an artist, you had to do what the Pope, had to do what the bishop, had to do what the abbot told you to do. And so, I mean, look at Shostakovich. He produced the wrong symphony. It wasn't to Stalin's liking. So yes, he produced brilliant symphonies that wouldn't have been produced, I think, in many cases in the West. Okay, we can get into the subsidy system and all the rest of it, but I go along with you. Sport, I'm a little bit mass sport, yes, but not full of drugs. So yeah, winning all those gold medals. But anyway, so I readily concede. So you had a situation, what I would argue, very different to the West. In other words, what I would argue is that the Soviet system viewed its workforce, and forgive me if this sounds, distasteful, but it viewed it in a similar way that you would slave labor. This was your property, and you wanted to develop it. And so, they wanted to improve the quality of the labor they had available to them. They wanted Soviet workers to produce more highly skilled children than they were. Okay, you could argue that was true in the West, but again, we're getting into territory I don't want to go into at the moment. Raphael, okay, if you want to call it capitalist, but it wasn't capitalism. That's the problem I've got. So if you concede that there wasn't money, if you concede that there wasn't commodity production, if you concede that there wasn't wage labor, then I just think that the category capitalism breaks down. It becomes meaningless. So if you want to call feudalism capitalism, go ahead. If you want to call slavery capitalism, go ahead. But I just don't think it's a useful category to apply to the Soviet Union. And just say, oh, it was the same as the United States or Britain or Germany. It wasn't. It was a radically different society. It was born of a proletarian revolution. It had radically different economic and social laws operating. Yes, they had peace rates, This is meant to maximize production. The problem is, Raphael, that it maximized the production of, how should I put it, target values. It didn't maximize the production of use values. So, what is, I've got a cup next to me. So imagine this was produced in the Soviet Union. The problem is the handle falls off. The problem is it leaks. So, okay, so they produced it with piecework. The problem is, if you compare a Soviet factory operating piecework to a Western factory operating piecework, what you'll find is, at least for half of the month, Soviet workers are sitting around playing cards and having cigarettes. For the next half of the month, they're storming their targets and producing, on average, shit. Now, you can argue, if you go into a Western car factory in the 50s and 60s, there will be an element of that. But if you go into a car factory now, you won't find that. Anyway, my point is that, yes, you're right, piecework operated, but not in the manner that you saw it in Japan, the United States, Britain, Germany. You talk about foreign trade. Foreign trade was marginal in the Soviet Union. It wasn't the equivalent of China, and we can get into China, what sort of society China is today. Either way, yes, it was in competition. So what? So what? So yes, it was in competition. But what we see, for example, in wartime conditions, is that the capitalists themselves suspend the law of value. And so you're also then dealing with a capitalism under those conditions, of where we at least ought to be talking about that this is a capitalism either in decline or in transition. The welfare state, unemployment benefit. Yes, it's capitalism, but, and what I would argue is that the Soviet Union wasn't capitalism, but then I would say, but yes, it was in competition with the West. How did it compete with the West? Did it introduce, wage labor? No. Did it introduce money? No. Did it produce commodities? And even when you take what it sold on the international market, it sold them as commodities. Did they produce them as commodities? No. As to your question of socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat, I think this is a separate subject, which I'm just not going to go there with. But I agree with you, the dictatorship of the proletariat begins with capitalism. But the idea that there was the dictatorship of the proletariat after the first 5-year plan, I have to say my jaw just drops and I just go, oh, come on. If that's an example of the rule of the working class, well, then we live under the dictatorship of the proletariat now, don't we? And ancient Rome was an example of the dictatorship of, no, it wasn't. This is a dictatorship over the proletariat. This is a proletariat that is exploited. That isn't the ruling class, that cannot organize itself politically. The term dictatorship of the proletariat, therefore, is not only meaningless, it makes a mockery of the category. It turns words into their complete opposite. It's like calling Nazi Germany a democracy and a haven of, enlightenment. I'm sorry, it wasn't. No, I don't agree.
Karl Draper went through all of the mentions, didn't he, of the dictatorship or the proletariat by Marx. I think there's 7 or 8, and all he meant 12. Okay, was the rule of the working class, and that's clear that that did not happen in the Soviet Union. Absolutely. We've got 7 or 8 comrades now still with their hand up, so I'm going to have to cut you very short, comrades. Please, can you keep to 2-3 minutes? I'm sorry, I know it's a huge subject, and we're going to continue discussing this, so apologies for having to cut you short. Paul Flewers, then Peter Kennedy, then Andy.
Right. Yeah, hold on. Yeah. That raised some very interesting points there, which I think need to be developed. I think dictatorship proletariat, well, that disappeared, but the bourgeoisie was not revived. And what you had I think, was a situation where, as Jack put it, primary accumulation, in other words, an industrial revolution, which had already taken place in Britain, France, Germany, USA under the bourgeoisie, had to be done with a different social force. And that was the elite, which appeared out of the party-state apparatus. And by going through this industrial revolution, became a fully fledged ruling elite. A very strange one, because it called itself socialist or communist or whatever, and ruled a non-market system, but in fact was nonetheless an elite. Now, if we look at the role of the state within capitalist society, again, Jack raised this, it's increasingly the case that the state intervenes. And even with today, with privatization and all the rest of it, it intervenes all the more. The first real blow of this was the First World War, where you had massive state intervention. And then it declined afterwards, but it never went away. And we saw after the crash of 29, state intervention in all different ways, and of course the Second World War. What I think Stalinism represented was a qualitative break, within that quantitative shift towards state intervention. In fact, you had state intervention to the level where the law of value was expunged. And therefore, the state had to intervene far more than under capitalism, and actually intervened in everyday life far more than under capitalism, broadly speaking, in a totalitarian manner under Stalin, and then in an authoritarian manner in his successors. And this was reproduced in the countries which developed under Stalinist parties, especially in China. But I think what we got is a means of looking from the general to the particular. We've actually got a way in which a very large, technologically, socially, very much underdeveloped country could implement primary accumulation, have an industrial revolution. And it required the suppression of the law of value. It also required an elite which would grab society by the throat and pull it forward at all costs, crushing all opposition on the way and everything. This has not occurred in other places other than China, the Soviet Union, and the subsidiary states, which would never have happened had they been independent of those. They were mini clones. Right. And as to wind up, the thing is, this process of accumulation could carry on, but for reasons I can't go into now for time, they had to revert to the market. The Soviet leadership left it far too late. If it had gone for the market in the 60s, it might have worked. The Chinese bureaucracy, staying in control politically, strongly controlling society, has implemented the market. It's gone back to the market and has been incredibly successful. If we go back 50 years, even 40 years, who would have thought that China would become the second biggest economy in the world? So Stalinism did work. But it had to revert to capitalism to continue accumulation. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Paul. Sorry to rush Conrad's along, but we do have quite a few people still with their hand up. Peter and then Andy, please.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Jack, for the talk. I enjoyed that. Just think, I was thinking, when you were saying that the Soviet Union was radically different, and yet you began the talk saying that we can use the model of capitalism to explain. So that to me, and it fits in with what you actually went on to say, that it's elements of capitalism that have been vital to understand the Soviet Union. In other words, the failure of some of the categories that work in capitalism, as we know, the failure of those categories to kind of play their role as they did in capitalism in the Soviet Union. So in that sense, there's not such a radical break. And I suppose it's all about looking at, it's not saying that, it's one of those situations really, isn't it? And because the society was kind of, it couldn't reproduce itself, well, it did for some time in a way, in an awful way, but eventually it collapsed. But it wasn't a society that could go on and develop. And that's because, there was value there, but it wasn't value. It wasn't the value form. There was exchange value. There was money there that, was kind of like an echo of that exchange value without the value form. So therefore, we could also say that workers did sell their labor power, but didn't quite sell their labor power properly. So workers could collectivize, but not quite in the same way as they could in the West. And so, I suppose what I'm saying is that we need to kind of have those nuances, because the Soviet Union was a failed revolution, but it was a failure born of the West. It emerged from the Western capitalism, So I think we should just kind of think of it in a more dialectical way with the trends in capitalism at the time. You referred, to imperialism. I think another speaker referred to the development of the state in the economy, and along with that, the ideas of Fabian socialism, if you like. There's all socializations, I would say, we're all prevalent in a way about how to manage the contradiction that you spoke of between use and exchange value and the commodity form. And this was taken to extreme, in the Soviet Union. So there was elements there in the dialectical way between the two societies. The thing I was going to ask you, though, was why did it collapse in the end? I mean, you spoke of in the 80s and 90s, the middle classes, entrepreneurs getting a bit kind of uneasy and wanting to break out and enjoy what was happening in the West. But, why then and not, throughout the other decades? What was it about the Soviet Union that actually broke down in the end? Okay.
Thanks, Peter. Andy, and then perhaps bring Jack back in.
I keep it short, but I don't know whether Jack's response will be particularly short if he wants to respond to it all. Jack has kind of repeated Tikhtin's assertion that the workers in the Soviet Union didn't behave like a class, were unable to behave like a class, were unable to organize. And it's quite a bold statement. And I'm just wondering if Jack could explain why he reached that conclusion.
Okay, I'll take one more then, if that's okay, Jack. Sandy, please.
Yeah, the creation of the Soviet Union was a big advance for the working class. I think there's no doubt about that. It changed capitalism itself internationally. Concessions were then made to the working class because the ruling class feared the Soviet Union and feared the working class taking power. So the creation of the Soviet Union was a big step forward, but the defeat and reintroduction of capitalism into the Soviet Union was a big step backward for the working class and a big blow to the working class. And I think you have to recognize that. And I very much disagree with Jack's point. It seemed to be that this was an inevitable process from about 1920, or from the defeat of the German Revolution. You weren't going to go anywhere else but eventually capitalism to be restored. In fact, there was the potential on a worldwide scale for other revolutions to link up and regenerate the working class in the Soviet Union. It didn't happen, but there was that potential. And I very much also disagree with this idea that there was nothing progressive in the Soviet Union to defend. Look at how the Soviet Union took on and defeated fascism. I mean, fascism launched that 6.5 million invasion, 6.5 million soldiers, and that was defeated by the Soviet working class, who were enthusiastic to fight back against that and still to defend the gains they had made Of course, Stalinism was a terrible distortion produced by the strength of imperialism, but that'll happen again if we don't have a worldwide revolution, and you have a revolution that only wins in part of the globe. You're going to have distortions. Look to Cuba, right? Look at the distortions that have been introduced in Cuba, but it's still, in my opinion, an advance. There's still something that communists defend there. And you also have to say, we don't take a liberal attitude. We don't say in Cuba, just all parties should be able to organise, the Americans should be able to pour in money and have a counter-revolution. No, the counter-revolution has to be suppressed. Not the working class, but the counter-revolution. And the imperialists always identified the Soviet Union as the enemy and put tremendous resources into undermining that system, right? And eventually they succeeded with the help of Stalinism. And most of the Trotskyist groups, I agree with Trotsky's analysis, but after 1940, most of the Trotskyist groups, as we can see now, are actually anti-communist groups, right? They're not communists. They, in fact, defend capitalism. And we've seen it over the Ukraine war, where whole sections of the Trotskyist movement have lined up with imperialism, and they attempt to for the imperialists to gain control of Russia, and they make it a semi-colony. And in that sense, the Russian Revolution still lives, because the Russian people are not allowing that to happen. They're fighting back, and communists should be siding with them against imperialism. That's what I'd like to say.
Thanks, Sandy. Jack, do you want to reply to a few things now?
Yeah, thank you, comrades. Useful discussion. I also appreciate your frustration because obviously it's a vast subject, and we've just scratched the surface. So I wish the rest of the series well, but I know that we'll all still recognize that a great deal more needs to be said. In terms of what you were saying, Paul, I agree more or less with everything you're saying, except the idea that if only, and I'm not saying you acting as the advisor, but if only the Soviet Union or whoever had gone earlier over to capitalism, over to the market in the 1960s, everything would have been hunky-dory and Chinese. I think that's basically your argument. I just think that's profoundly wrong. I made the argument that we cannot understand what happened in China simply on the basis of Deng Xiaoping's brilliance. This was the United States in terms of its global strategy, seeking to defeat the Soviet Union and therefore doing a deal. And China basically sold its soul, didn't it? I mean, who of us, at least of a certain age, I mean, when China welcomed the Pinochet coup in Chile, I mean, for God's sake, you know, when China sided with the conservative counter-revolutionary forces, you know, in 1974, 75 in Portugal, and I can go on. So I don't think that was an option. And indeed, you know, what happened in Eastern Europe, what happened in the Soviet Union, i.e., especially in the Soviet Union, massive drop in real living standards, tumbling back of life expectancy. All of this testifies to what would have happened in the 1960s, in my opinion. So I don't buy into, you know, the Chinese road, you know, represents some sort of alternative history with Stalin and his successors. But that option was there. It was discussed, and sometimes not that hidden away. You can look at economic problems. I've mentioned it before, of socialism in the USSR, 1952. Stalin talks about reintroducing the law of value. It's just ridiculous. But nonetheless, the capitalist temptation, in order to introduce rationality, was always there. But also behind that, let's get our hands on some real wealth that we can pass on to our children, real privileges that we can enjoy along with the capitalist class. in the West. In terms of what Peter was saying, I'm not going to go into the use of words, but you asked, why did it collapse? And if I was going to give one answer there, I would say it was running out of people. That didn't mean that the population was going down, but the population increase that it needed to open new enterprises was going down, down, down. In other words, the rate of increase was leveling off, and the system required new workers. So you can read general secretaries talking about women not having enough children. How do we encourage more children? Well, when women actually have a triple burden, they're fully employed in the workplace. They have to go to political meetings, and then they do the bulk of the housework. It's no surprise that what you had in European Russia tended towards one child, not because of some policy introduced from above, but just the sheer grind and the inability of a couple to produce labor either at the same level culturally or a superior level. They couldn't do it with more than one child. It just became impossible. And therefore they limited their families. And whatever incentives the system put there, you know, like glorious socialist motherhood and prizes for having 13 children, it didn't work. It predictably didn't work. So again, I would urge comrades just to look at the political reports of prime ministers, general secretaries, the population question. We're running out of workers, and they attempt to introduce new machinery. It doesn't work. They just cannot succeed. They don't understand themselves why they cannot succeed, but they know they're not succeeding. And so they're like what's the poem? They weren't waving, they were drowning. That's what was going on in the Soviet Union. So why the collapse? Not 1991. It could have been earlier. It could have been later. But I think we can say that it was inevitable that it was going to collapse. Andy, you asked me, I don't know, the inability of the working class to organize. Well, there was, that's just, where were the alternative parties? Where were the alternative unions? Where were any sort of working class self-organized political activity? You found it, but usually people end up in prison, end up arrested, end up in mental asylums. I don't really know why you're asking the question.
I think he was asking, you know, I mean, today the working class isn't really active as a working class. You know, I think the way you said it, he's that's not even a working class in the making, and not even a potential working class, I think is what he wanted to say.
Okay, well, look, all I can say, Andy, is what you had in the Soviet Union is a situation where workers were atomized. They were in trade unions. That's true. But trade unions basically controlled by the enterprise manager, by the KGB, by the elite. But what you had in terms of industrial relations is a situation where workers might act as a collective, but appealing to their comrade, enterprise manager, against the bureaucracy as a collective, to use a phrase. So it was a very different dynamic that what you get under capitalism. The workers identified with their enterprise manager, and to some degree, the enterprise manager had to identify with their workers, had to fight for the interests of their workers if they wanted to retain them. They didn't want to get rid of them, quite the opposite. So they wanted to satisfy wage demands, demands for food, demands for time off, demands for cultural facilities. If they could produce it, they would concede it. Sandy, you're quite right. The Soviet Union coming into existence triggered a whole wave of concessions in the West. So if you look at Britain, universal suffrage, comes in, what, 29, but clearly under the impact of the October Revolution, along with all sorts of welfare state provision. That is true. But at the same time, what you had is the Soviet Union held up as a dire warning. And if you look at the early Soviet leaders, so if you read Ben Lewis, he did a very good, quite inspiring translation of Zinoviev's speech at the Halle Congress of the Independent Social Democrat Party. Half of it went off to join the communists. The other half went off eventually to rejoin official social democracy. What was interesting about his speech is Zinoviev talks about starvation, dire poverty in the Soviet Union. By the time we get to the 30s, that just becomes anti-Soviet propaganda. So where Lenin would have campaigned for American aid to the starving in Soviet Russia, in Stalin's Soviet Union, this was dismissed as Western propaganda, Western lies. No one starved, and official communist parties repeated it. The problem was that starvation was true, and the dire situation of workers in the Soviet Union, the rightless position of workers in the Soviet Union, was used as an anti-communist weapon. And I don't think it's correct just to dismiss that as, oh, that's just lying capitalist propaganda. The problem is that there was truth in it. Okay, as to the rest of it, Soviet workers resisted Nazis. Well, so did Soviet peasants. And I suppose when a genocidal regime comes along and says, we want to reduce you to slaves, they looked at their semi-slave position and they said, well, okay, we're going to fight. Okay. But is this testimony to working class rule? I don't think so. I think it's a rather bizarre reading of it, let alone the situation now. Putin's Russia, well, of course, it's a sort of continuation in some peculiar sense of the October Revolution, but it's been turned into its opposite long ago. So I just don't buy, your Putin apologetics. We can oppose our own ruling class without peddling any illusions in Putin or the Russian Federation. I oppose NATO. I oppose the proxy war in Ukraine. I'm for the defeat of both sides. I don't think that we want to engage in apologetics and somehow that the Putin regime represents something positive. It doesn't. It's a reactionary, how should we put it, undemocratic, kleptocratic, capitalist regime. So I don't know why we need to dress it up. Yes, you've got some on the left, it's disgracefully, that have gone along with the Western narrative, socialist resistance, alliance for workers' liberty, sections of the Labour left. Yes, they're disgraceful. They're traitors. They are scabs. I agree with you. But we don't need to scab on our own class and join Putin and become an apologist for Putin. We can be against both. And to me, well, I'm not saying it's a direct parallel, but there is a parallel. World War I didn't have to dress up Kaiser Germany, or you didn't have to dress up, France or Britain. We were against both sides. So that's really my position on that one, Sandy.
Thanks, Jack. 3 more comrades with their hands up. Please be concise. First, Tony, then Tobias, then William.
Yeah, hi, Jack. I mean, the question is really very simple. If the Soviet Union was not a socialist country, then the question, what was it? Given that there was no general commodity production, given that there was no production for the market, given there was no production for profit, in essence, it was production for use values in however a bureaucratic way. It was clearly not capitalist. I don't see the merits of searching forever for a suitable label, and therefore I'm quite happy to accept the term degenerated worker state, because it doesn't really say in what way it degenerated and how it was degenerating and what was the engine, if you like, of the economy. Clearly, it had some strengths. Stalin was able to industrialize, and the Soviet Union was able, in the end, to defeat Hitler. Incidentally, the Soviet Union defeated Hitler not because of Stalin, but despite Stalin. Anyone who studied the era knows that when there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union went along with it wholeheartedly and had great illusions in the Hitler state, so much so that he deported German communists back to Hitler's Germany, and Russia was supplying Hitler with oil, coal, God knows what resources. And it was an immense surprise, despite the warnings that he'd received, that Hitler was going to break the pact and invade in Operation Barbarossa. But really, that's, I suppose, besides the point. As for why, in the end, it transitioned to capitalism, I'm not convinced that it was simply a question of running out of people. I think it was the military competition from the United States and the West in particular, that it was unable to generate, if you like, the economic base which could sustain a military challenge. Coupled with a dissatisfaction, certainly in its Eastern European satellites, but also amongst its own people. In the end, I think the ruling elite came to the conclusion there was no alternative but to actually go for capitalism. I don't see today, incidentally, Russia as an imperialist power, certainly not in terms of Ukraine, and that's where I think there's a difference with the First World War. Russia was very much the victim of NATO expansion and aggrandizement. It doesn't mean to say, therefore, that victory to Russia is an adequate slogan. However, just one or two other points. The question is, how has China broken the mold, in a sense? Because China is now the second major economy in the world, and it clearly does pose a threat. And how do we characterize China? And I would say that it's an unusual formation, and it may be a formation in transition. But in essence, it is state-directed capitalism, whereby the capitalists don't have political power, but they have economic power, albeit of a limited nature, because the state retains overall control. However, I would see in the future a competition between, if you like, the party bosses and whatever political formation comes out of those who hold economic power. But that is for the future. That's just a prediction. It may or may not come about. But China clearly, for whatever reason, the development of market forces, but controlled strictly by the state, has proved, at least in the short term, effective. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Tobias, please.
Can you hear us now?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, look, being called this late in the discussion, I'm not going to go on at great length, but I mean, I still, as I have for the last 50 years, believe it was a degenerated worker state, and I would characterize the other countries, such as China, the Eastern European ones, Cuba, as deformed worker states. bureaucratically deformed, bureaucratically degenerated in the case of the USSR. I'm sticking to that position. I think some of the pro-Ukraine Trotskyists, the USAC, I think they use theory, something like societies in transition, which seems a totally meaningless phrase. I stick with the old one. But the point I was going to make, I'm not going to spend my time trying to defend Trotsky's general theory, but the situation immediately in the last phases of World War II and immediately afterwards, it seems to me potentially, I know this is counterfactual, but there was a way out in the sense the revolution could have taken hold in Italy, in France, and to some, it did in Greece, though it was defeated partly by Churchill's lot and partly by Stalin's betrayal. It did succeed off its own bat without much ready army involvement in Yugoslavia out of the resistance movement. So, I mean, I think, you know, hypothetically, if it had been France, Italy, Greece that had, where the revolution had triumphed, that would have had an effect on the Soviet Union. I think possibly even though you still had the bastard Stalin in charge, that it could have regenerated the Soviet Union if the revolution had spread at that point to the West. I mean, Stalin sabotaged that the instructions he gave to the official communist parties were dreadful. I mean, you know, from Togliatti or Torres or whoever. I mean, Tito was disobedient, the Greek leader was disobedient, and the Greek leader got the support of the Yugoslavs for a period anyway. But I'm just saying that there was not just 1917 to 23 where there was a possibility of expanding the revolution in the West, but I think there was a second phase where it might have been able to happen. The last point I want to make is, what do you think of Cuba? I mean, I agree that it's getting closer and closer to capitalist restoration, but if the Americans don't do a deal with it, it in a sense keeps it sort of frozen where it is. I mean, it moved a bit down, you know, it did do go down the kind of Chinese road a bit with Raoul and with this new guy whose name I don't remember offhand. Okay, I'll leave it there. Okay, I'm glad I'm not the only person who defended the degenerate workers' state position, but I don't think it's compatible with saying the Soviet Union was capitalist, which I think someone else, Raphael, said he degenerate workers' state, but it was capitalist. Well, that seems to be absolute rubbish. I mean, the property couldn't be inherited, as Trotsky said in Revolution Betrayed, that the bureaucrats couldn't pass property on to their children. And you actually said this, Jack, as one of the features of the bureaucrats becoming bourgeois at the end. Okay, leave it there.
Thanks, Toby. Okay, William is the last speaker from the floor, and then we give Jack a chance to sum up.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased that I'm the last speaker because what I have to say is the last time I'm ever going to be on this program. Last week, I was personally attacked by this individual here, Conrad, who I don't represent myself when I come here. I represent different groups of Irish youth that discuss Marx and discuss nationalism and discuss socialism. And his chauvinistic, jingoistical British attitude towards me last week means that we are not going to have anything more to do with us, right? So to hell with you, Conrad. We don't want to know you. Right, bye.
Okay. All right, over back to you, Jack. You want to reply to a few questions and comments from the floor?
Well, I think I've done you a small favor there, but anyway, I'll leave that one aside. Really starting, I'm not going to go over the whole discussion. I'm just going to pick up on the last few comrades. Tony, you started off by saying, well, what's a label? And really that's been my point. I mean, comrades can stick to whatever damn label they want. They can call it social formation X, you can call it pink elephants, you can call it, I don't know, anything you choose, you can give it a figure. The point is to try to actually understand it and how it moved. So, you know, I'm not going to speak now, you know, oh, here you are, I've got the answer with China and come out with a label. That's not understanding it. Just getting an impression of China and looking at it now and where it's come from and speculating. Well, I'm not saying it's valueless, but I don't think it's really Marxism. Marxism is surely about getting to grips with what lies under the surface. It takes work. We could all swap different labels between us, and we've come up with, I mean, a good dozen, I mean, including myself, you know, I've come up with more than one or two, but that's not the point. So we need to go beneath the surface. And okay, so if someone wants to call it a degenerate workers' state, Toby, I admire your faithfulness. For 50 years, you've not changed your mind. Okay, great, fine. The problem is that it's not a workers' state. So, okay, how did it collapse? Why did it show these features I talked about of quantity but not quality? Why did the working class not carry out a political revolution as Trotsky? And I thought it could, you know, in the 1980s, 1990. We've got to come up with something better than just turning to Trotsky. I think it's an insult to Trotsky's memory just to repeat, mindlessly his formulation, provisional formulation from the 1930s. Okay, so Tony comes out with, I think it was arms competition. Okay, Tony, fine. The question is, of course, there was arms competition. There was arms competition, you said, in World War II. Look at the Soviet Union. In spite of Stalin, you said, the Soviet Union presumably produced more tanks, more artillery pieces, could put more people into the field. It could overpower Nazi Germany. Yes, I agree. So how comes then it collapsed in the 1980s and 1990s? What's going on in that society? Why didn't Stalin, surrender to the West at the end of World War II when he had an alliance? To me, that's all superficial. We need to try to understand the society itself. And okay, you come out with a brilliant discovery that China is an unusual society. I agree, but let's study it. Let's study it rather than just speculate. I haven't studied it. I mean, I know enough to be very careful when I come out, you know, when I make remarks about China. I'm extremely cautious. So yeah, just coming out with a label and imagining I've solved something, I've solved absolutely nothing. Okay, so Toby, you have mentioned. Okay, Toby. So instead of Stalin doing a deal with Roosevelt and Churchill, he said, no, I'm going to fight you. What then happens? Because that's what you're talking about. Okay, so we imagine for a moment that the official communists come to power in France, Italy, and Greece. Okay. What politics have they got? What model do they aspire? Would it be radically different to a European version of China? Would it be that different to Poland or GDR or Czechoslovakia? I find it hard to imagine. Official communism comes to power in other countries. The idea that then that allows a generation, a regeneration of working class power in the Soviet Union, I just don't see why. That's like looking at China, 1949. What evidence have you got that Mao's revolution in China allowed the regenerate, or they take over the GDR, or Poland, Vietnam? Where's the regeneration of working class power? I see the working class having no political power throughout the 20s. Well, I should know, let me correct myself. Throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So yes, the mass killing stopped, that's true. But working class power didn't regenerate. To me, the theory you're putting forward is very much of Isaac Deutscher. But it doesn't work, does it? So anyway, I just think that life has disproved that. So it's a nice thought, Toby, but I can't really believe it. What do I think Cuba is? Let's go away and study it. That's what we should do. So you ain't going to get, I mean, I could give you the label bureaucratic socialism, but that's not enough. And I'm not saying that, you know, we could understand China today taking the approach that I've done in terms of the particular categories. I don't think they apply. So we need to be concrete here and not, how should I put it, imagine that, you know, we don't need to study. We do need to study, and that's what Marxists, I don't think, have done enough of, Toby, over the last 50 years.
Thank you very much, Jack. Thanks very much, comrades, for coming in and asking questions. The USSR still manages to divide the left clearly, and that won't change anytime soon. But let's continue looking at these issues and hopefully learn together and move on together. So, comrades, next week we're looking at, I've just put it in the chat, Peter Kennedy is looking at the role of Stalinism within the left in establishing social democratic reform and class containment in Britain post-1945. We're going to look at some other aspects of the Soviet Union as well, and I'll email comrades about it. Thanks very much, Jack.